Welcome back to Study Hall, listeners.
Yeah.
You know how we do things around here. We take these complex topics and we kind of really get into them. And today, oh boy, do we have a doozy. It's this whole thing about renaming American landmarks.
Yeah, it's really fascinating to see how this is playing out because it's not just about changing a sign or updating a map.
Right.
It's tied into, this whole executive order that came out restoring names that honor American greatness.
Mm-hmm.
And it brings up all these questions about how we view history, how we choose to celebrate it, and how that all feeds into this idea of national identity.
It really makes you think, right? Like, what makes a landmark worthy of a certain name? What stories are we trying to tell? Or maybe even trying to erase?
Mm-hmm.
And for our listeners who might not be completely up to speed, we're talking about things like Mount McKinley.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, that's a prime example. They're going back to using Mount McKinley for North America's highest peak.
Which, if you remember, they officially changed to Denali back in 2015.
Yeah.
So it's like we're going back in time, in a way.
It is. And it's interesting because they're highlighting President McKinley's legacy. His time as president, the Spanish-American War, all of that.
Right. Making a case that taking his name off the mountain was kind of like disrespecting his place in history.
Exactly. But then there's this other layer to it. They're not getting rid of Denali entirely. The national park surrounding the mountain, that's still going to be Denali National Park.
Right, and they even mentioned working with Alaskan Native groups to name other landmarks in the area. So it's not like a complete erasure of that history.
Exactly. And that's what makes it so interesting, right?
Absolutely.
Is this a genuine attempt at recognizing indigenous perspectives?
Right.
Or is it more of like a token gesture?
Yeah, it's like, how do we balance all these different perspectives, these different stories about the same place?
Exactly. I mean, think about it. Whose history are we really prioritizing here?
It's a tough question.
Even though they talk about local culture and history, that whole emphasis on American greatness kind of suggests a very specific viewpoint.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
And speaking of specific viewpoints, well, we have to talk about what's probably the most, let's just say controversial part of this whole executive order.
Oh, yeah.
The idea of renaming the Gulf of Mexico.
The Gulf of America.
The Gulf of America,
Yeah.
Yep.
Bold move.
Definitely bold. And the reasons they give, well, they're interesting. They talk about how important the Gulf is to the U.S. economy, all the natural resources, the fishing industry, oil and gas.
Right. They even get into specifics, snapper, shrimp, grouper, stone crab. Like, they're trying to make this connection.
Like, American abundance.
Exactly. Like, this is America's bounty right here in this Gulf.
It's really fascinating how language is being used here. But let's be real, there's a whole other side to this coin.
Oh, absolutely.
Renaming something as huge and well-known as the Gulf of Mexico, I mean, that's going to cause some confusion internationally.
For sure. I mean, other countries border the Gulf, What are they going to think?
It's hard not to see it as a bit provocative, right? And what about, cultural sensitivity?
Yeah.
Think about Mexico. Their history is woven into the name Gulf of Mexico. And the indigenous communities who've lived along the Gulf Coast for centuries.
It makes you wonder, do the potential benefits, which seem mostly symbolic, really outweigh the potential problems?
It's a valid question.
Yeah.
And let's not forget the practical side of things.
Oh, yeah.
We're talking about a massive body of water. Renaming it. Think of the logistics. Maps, charts, textbooks, everything.
It's a huge undertaking.
And a costly one, I'd imagine. So what do you think? What jumps out at you as the biggest potential impact of this whole Gulf of America idea?
I think the scariest part is this could set a precedent.
Oh, how so?
If the U.S. pulls this off, other countries might try the same thing. I mean, we're already seeing debates about renaming things all over the world.
That's true. Driven by social movements, attempt to correct past wrongs, this could really throw fuel on that fire.
Absolutely. It's like we're entering this new era of symbolic reckoning. Every nation wants to control how their past is portrayed.
It's fascinating, but also kind of scary, right?
It is. It really makes you think, who gets to decide whose history is told, whose is remembered, whose is, maybe even erased? And it all comes down to this, right? When these symbols, these names become like battlegrounds, who gets to say which story wins?
Yeah, it's a really tough question. And I think this executive order, it just highlights how messy all of this is. I mean, we've been talking about Mount McKinley, the Gulf, but this thing goes way beyond that, right?
Absolutely. This sets a precedent.
Right.
It changes how we think about commemorating history. It opens up this whole can of worms about, we name things, how we remember the past.
It's like we're not just arguing about a mountain or a gulf. We're talking about a whole shift in how we see American greatness and whose stories are important enough to be like literally carved into the landscape.
Exactly. And that brings up another big question.
Yeah.
What's the yardstick here? What are they using to make these decisions?
Right, right.
The order mentions getting public input, especially with the semi-quincentennial coming up.
The 250th anniversary of the U.S. for our listeners who don't know.
Right. But how do we make sure those voices are really representative, that everyone's included?
That's a challenge, right? Especially now, with things so divided, how do we make sure this whole renaming thing doesn't just become another way to, push people apart?
I think transparency is key. We need to know what criteria they're using, have an open discussion about whose stories are being told and whose are being left out. And we have to think about the context,
Right, the historical context.
We can't judge people from the past by today's standard.
Exactly. We have to see the good and the bad, the whole picture.
Exactly. And that takes, nuance, critical thinking, being willing to face some uncomfortable truths.
It's not about erasing history. It's about understanding it better, representing it in a way that includes everybody.
Right. I think this executive order, it's like they accidentally opened up a Pandora's box, all these questions about history, identity, how we remember things.
It's a conversation we should have been having all along, maybe.
Probably. And as we get closer to the semi-quincentennial, things are just going to get more heated.
Absolutely. It'll be interesting to see how the public reacts, what kind of criteria they come up with for deciding, whose names end up on things.
Definitely. And don't forget the practical side of things.
Oh, right. We talked about the potential problems with renaming the Gulf of Mexico, but there are logistical problems too, right?
Huge ones. Think about all the maps, documents, signs, all the records that would have to be changed.
Oh, man. That's a huge amount of work.
And money. It makes you think maybe that money could be better spent on, actual problems like education, healthcare.
Yeah. It's like, how do we honor the past without forgetting about the present, the future?
That's the million-dollar question. And there's no easy answer. It takes a lot of thought, discussion, being willing to meet in the middle.
Okay, so let's say you're on this committee, right?
Yeah.
Your job is to rename some big landmark, maybe a famous statue or a historic building. What's most important to you when making that decision?
Okay, well, first things first. You need a clear set of rules. What are the values of this community? Those rules might be about historical importance, contributions to society, things like diversity, inclusion, social justice.
So it's not just picking a name that sounds good or that makes people feel a certain way.
Yeah.
It's about a choice that reflects history and a commitment to showing it accurately and in a way that makes sense.
Absolutely. And you need to get everyone involved. Historians, community leaders, people from groups who've been marginalized. The goal is to come up with a decision that honors the past, acknowledges the complexities, and reflects how society is changing.
It's like with all this renaming, we're not just looking back, we're also shaping how we see ourselves, going forward. It's about what we choose to highlight, the values we want to put on a pedestal.
You got it. It's not just symbolic. It really affects how we see ourselves as a nation, how the world sees us. Take that Gulf of America idea.
Right.
What message are we sending there? Are we saying, hey, we're strong, we're in charge, or does it come off as, trying to take over other people's culture?
It's a big question, and it shows how important it is to really think things through, talk to everyone involved before making a big change like that. We got to hear from everyone, not just the people who agree with, certain political view or version of history.
I couldn't agree more. And that means listening to the people who say, hey, wait a minute, this isn't right. It's easy to just ignore them, but they often have good points. They can help us avoid messing things up, maybe even come up with better ideas.
It's about finding that balance, right?
Yeah.
Honoring the past, but also being able to move forward. We can't pretend history didn't happen, but we can't let it hold us back from growing, changing with the times.
You said it, and we got to be humble about it. Admit that what we think we know about history, it can change. What people thought was great back then, we might see it completely differently now.
And this whole executive order, with its focus on American greatness, it seems to have a pretty narrow idea of what that means. An idea that honestly might not fit with how every American sees things.
Yeah, I see what you mean. It makes you wonder if there's a better way to do this, a way that's more, inclusive, that takes into account everyone's story. Maybe instead of focusing on individuals, we could commemorate events, movements, ideals, things that speak to a wider range of American experiences.
That's an interesting thought. So instead of renaming the Gulf of Mexico, maybe we create a monument that honors the indigenous people who lived there for centuries, recognize what they brought to that region.
Exactly. Or a memorial to the slave trade, you
Right.
know? Acknowledge the horrors of it, but also celebrate the strength and the contributions of African Americans.
Those are just a couple of ideas,
Yeah.
but they show how we could move beyond just honoring individuals and really try to capture the whole picture of history.
Right. The goal is to build these like landmarks of memory that are both true and inspiring to show how rich and complicated American history is, but also to challenge us to be our best selves.
Well said. So, as we wrap up our deep dive into this executive order, all the talk about renaming landmarks, I want to leave you with this. If you could rename a landmark, what would guide your choice? What story would you want that name to tell? And how would you make sure everyone's voice is heard, that the process is fair? It's something to think about as we try to make sense of our past and build a better future. Thanks for joining us on this journey, listeners. Until next time, keep those minds sharp.